afternoon, everyone. My name is Darrell Hudson, a James S. Jackson Professor and Chair of the Department of Health Behavior and Health Equity. On behalf of the department, I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual book conversation with Dr. Arline Geronimus to discuss her book, Weathering the Extraordinary Stress of Ordinary Life in an Unjust Society. This event is part of the Department of Health Behavior and Health Equity's 50th year commemoration. So no matter what the iteration, we changed names and different iterations of HBHE. Nonetheless, we've been here for 50 years, and we like to commemorate that moment, not just in this talk, but throughout the academic year. We've been having a number of events to commemorate and celebrate our contributions to the broader field of public health, and especially in regard to health behavior and health equity. In that spirit, it's especially meaningful to spend this hour with Dr. Geronimus, whose work has been amongst the most influential and forward-thinking in health equity. I'd also like to disclose that Dr. Geronimus was on my dissertation committee back when I was a student here as a doctoral student a long, long time ago now. Dr. Geronimus' scholarship has fundamentally changed how we think about and understand nuances around birth outcomes and birth outcome inequities, maternal child health, and so much more. Many different paradoxical findings that we'll dig into today with Dr. Geronimus. But I'd really like to just take my hat off to acknowledge Dr. Geronimus's outstanding contributions, not just to scholarship, but also what she's poured into students. And many of my favorite moments in my training were under Dr. Geronimus's tutelage. So our format today will be conversational. I've drafted about 5 questions or so to help us kick things off today, but we'll be watching the chat, and you can certainly place questions that you might have in the chat, and we'll try to read those questions as we go along, and certainly at the end of our conversation. And so we'll talk on the origin of the book. We'll speak on the origin of the book, evolution of the weathering framework. We'll talk a little bit about what Dr. Geronimus sees as the most urgent, pressing challenges that she sees for research, practice, and policy right now. And as I mentioned before, we would really like to involve you all in the conversation as well. So we're looking forward to the question and answer period. So just a quick note of appreciation for everyone who's joined us today or who might catch this on YouTube later on. I also thank Dr. Geronimus for the time and the consideration and being part of this conversation, all the many contributions that she has made, as I mentioned, to the field and to the development of so many students along the way. So we're in for a treat today. So I'd like to bring in Dr. Geronimus, and thank you again for joining us today, and looking forward to the conversation.
My pleasure, Darrell. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned before we got started up today, I've just drafted up a few softball questions for you. These are questions that you know well. And one of the first questions that I have to start us off is just defining what weathering is. You've famously coined this term. It's on the cover of your book. Generally, as I understand it, is thinking about how systemic injustice contributes to accelerate aging among historically marginalized groups. But for those who are new to your work, we have a bunch of first-year MPH students who may never have taken your courses, or even the general public who might tune in at some point, might be tuning in right now. How would you describe weathering?
Weathering, excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Weathering is a structurally rooted biopsychosocial process that leaves, as you put it, marginalized population groups vulnerable to dying or becoming very sick or disabled, being vulnerable to both infectious and chronic diseases long before they are chronologically old. So it's a different way of looking at growth, development, and aging than we usually do. And it suggests that between populations, crudely referred to maybe as dominant populations versus marginalized populations. Your health at age, say, 15 is not the same as the other group at age 15, even less so at 25 or 35, and especially less so by age 60. So it's a very different orientation to thinking about age than the ones we usually use, which kind of assume a kind of developmental, biology that leads to different life stages and different degrees of health that sort of correspond with your chronological age. And I want to be clear that the fundamental causes of weathering originate in the social world, but it works through human biological processes to exert its impact on morbidity and mortality and accelerated aging. So in some ways, what weathering is offering is an additional or an alternative view of how we biologically age, conditional on our sort of social position or structural position in our context. So I don't know if you're asking about those biological mechanisms, but I could talk about them briefly just to make it a little more concrete. The inner workings of our bodies, of human bodies, are always active. We're always trying to calibrate what's going on in our bodies to what's in our environment or any challenges in our environment, whether it's, we suddenly get very cold, we'll start shivering. This all happens automatically. And it's really a wondrous fact that our bodies can do this. But a part of that I don't think has been as emphasized in public health is that we're also our neuroendocrinology. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble speaking today, obviously.
That's okay. It's a mouthful. That word is always a mouthful. Neuroimmunology or endocrinology, whichever variant you're going to there.
Our neuroendocrine systems are exquisitely attuned to any sort of cues in our environment that we're not safe, we're in danger. And that can be literal life or death danger, and that's what most people think about, the sort of fight or flight reaction to the lion, coming at you. But we're also exquisitely attuned to dangers to our emotional safety, our identity safety, so our safety as a member of a certain cultural or class group, and our psychosocial safety. And those are very important to weathering, as well as literal physical environmental stressors or life or death situations, which unfortunately do also happen for members of marginalized groups. But I want to highlight the psychosocial and the emotional safety and the identity safety. Are you safe in whatever environment you're in, whether that environment is a physical environment with pollution and hazards, or it's an environment in your classroom where you don't feel you belong? And so when your neuroendocrine system kind of picks up on various cues, which those cues in terms of the psychosocial ones, because you're fluent in the dominant culture, whatever group you're from, if you've been raised in the United States or lived here long enough, you're also, it's sort of what Du Bois called double consciousness. You're also fluent in the ways that the dominant culture has sort of coded you just on the basis of some phenotype as deserving or not deserving, or intelligent or not intelligent, or capable or competent, whatever it is. And in a way, your life between those two consciousnesses is kind of, you're stuck between, in a way, an accusation and a denial. And so in those circumstances of fluency, your neuroendocrine system will also pick up on cues in your environment. And this is where it can apply to classrooms or any kind of environment with other people, any integrated environment, I should say, that will set off spontaneously your physiological stress reaction. And what happens there, as many people know, is your blood becomes flooded with stress hormones, and they do a variety of things we're all aware of: increasing your heart rate, increasing your breathing rate. They also, less well known, is they also sort of catapult fats and sugars and even immune cells out of their storage sites, sort of to kind of stoke those large muscles that need to fight or flee. And so that human response is ideally short. Certainly in the circumstance where you're being chased by the lion, it's going to be short. Either you're caught and die, or you escape and it's over. One way or another, I think Robert Sapolsky talks about it being 3 minutes long. And then all your processes and workings of your body go back to normal, and there's kind of no harm, no foul, little or no permanent damage. But what weathering draws on is the fact that, especially in the cases that aren't just acute life or death dangers, but are these more impartamorphous, in the air, in our minds from our fluency in both dominant culture and our own culture, that those they don't recede, and so the stress hormones don't recede, and so you're chronically exposed to these fats and sugars circulating in your blood. Your immune system can get dysregulated. These things can lead to, all the things we think that are due to diet and exercise, which is not to say those don't play a role too. But I think people are not aware of how much being chronically exposed to these kinds of stressors also lead to hypertension or an enlarged heart or diabetes or abdominal obesity, or the dysregulation of your immune system can lead to greater susceptibility to things like COVID, or for that matter, to autoimmune diseases like lupus. So, and this accumulates as you age. So the older you get, starting at, zero probably, or even pre-zero, the more you've accumulated these threats to your physical health, and your body systems become eroded and dysfunctional or weak.
Thanks for that very comprehensive response. I think that what I've retained from not just this response, but just hearing you in different formats before talking about this work, is that stress gets under the skin. And going back to that documentary, which I think you introduced me to, at least, Stress: Portrait of a Killer, which the main subject in that was Robert Sapolsky, who's this neuropsychologist out at Stanford, who talks about why zebras don't get ulcers. And so there's a pride of, I don't know if they call zebras in a group, pride, posse, conference of zebras hanging out on the savannah, and then a threat emerges, and that could be a lion, a leopard, or anything else that chases down zebras and eats them. And for a zebra, it's, as Sapolsky and you mentioned, it's 3 minutes of terror, and that people, or these zebras, their hearts increase capacity to pump blood to get to their muscles, to get them out of there. Lungs expand capacity to take in oxygen to fuel them in their either fight or their flight. But for human beings, our bodies are not as sophisticated. We simply can't turn that response off, nor is our bodies sophisticated enough to be able to discern between a threat such as a lion on the savannah. On the proverbial savannah nowadays, it's social evaluative threat. So someone judging you negatively based upon as you mentioned, different characteristics of your identity, things that you can't control, like your skin color, oftentimes your social class, where you're born and raised, where you live. So those things become factors that really do make a big difference in terms of stress getting under the skin, because those are experiences that people are having and they're accumulating over the life course,
Right.
piling up, and all those, as you mentioned, all those stress hormones are accumulating. And then also you've got that, just the conditioning that goes along with it, where people are becoming vigilant. They're becoming hyper vigilant to their environment. They're waiting for the next thing to drop. So they're carrying a lot of ambient stress around
Right.
in their bodies, even in the absence of this threat being there.
And one thing I would add in terms of how this contributes to weathering, excuse me, or accelerated aging, is that it's not just the stress response and how it affects, say, your blood vessels or your heart or circulatory system, or the kind of neon lights of what stress does to your body. But it's also part of that response is you kind of divert nutrients and oxygen away from other organs and tissues in your body.
Right.
That means if you're carrying a fetus, for example, you're diverting oxygen and nutrients away from that fetus.
Yeah.
It means if this is prolonged, which is what I'm saying our social structures lead it to be for certain groups, that it's not just that you're over exercising your heart and getting an enlarged heart, or pumping too hard on your arterial walls. It's also that other parts of your body are not getting what they need. They may even, parts of them may be cannibalized for proteins to help stoke the stress response along with the fats and sugars. So all parts of your body are in some ways affected, not just the ones that are immediately involved in a stress reaction.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you again. And I think that's such an interesting set of phenomena to be characterizing through, again, this very groundbreaking terminology around weathering. In your book, you challenge this comfortable notion. I remember reading the text, and you talk about what oftentimes people are assuming is going to happen. You get to live to an old age, and when you get to an older age, that's when you'll start to experience some difficulties. Like maybe it's some limitations around your ability. Maybe there's some limitations regarding chronic disease, but that's not always the case, especially for people who've been marginalized, historically marginalized groups don't get to necessarily experience that old age and all that comes with it in terms of the generative stage of the developmental cycle, like seeing their kids and their grandkids grow, getting to experience all those different birthdays and all those different memories. So could you speak a little bit about the psychological and social implications of, living in communities where life is really truncated in a very meaningful, significant way, where many people are not reaching those older ages.
Right.
They're not getting to experience those milestones. Could you talk a little bit about how that affects the social and psychological factors in those types of communities?
Yeah, and it's very complex actually in many ways, and has all kinds of impacts. Some of them are countervailing. There's this expression that Black people, die sooner or live quicker and sicker. I'm getting it all wrong. I'm sure you probably know the expression, but live sicker and die quicker. That's it. And what I want to first say is it's more a probabilistic thing. It's not that everybody has a truncated life.
Right.
It's not that everybody will die young, but it's that there's a chance that anyone at any age could die or become disabled or in some ways physically limited or have functional limitations. And so socially, that does a few things. One is the one I think you're pointing to, which it means that people in those communities suffer more losses and at earlier ages, and that, and more trauma. And that's critically important. And we need to be adapting educational settings, hospital settings, health, basically interventions of any kind, to recognizing that people from some communities have, including children, have already suffered deep losses. And in fact, some of what weathering does is it can affect your brain architecture in ways where you have what's called a stress adapted brain, which makes you more reactive to possible cues to being in danger, even if they may be false alarms. It's not, I want to be clear when I say false alarms, I'm not saying that you're crazy or a snowflake or you're perceiving a stress that isn't there, but that your life experience has kind of impressed upon you that it's more important to react to a false alarm than to miss the true one.
Right.
So I just wanted to clarify that. So, but there's other ways this affects what you call social infrastructure, which is historically marginalized groups have been dealing with this for centuries. And so they've evolved or developed or certainly invest in sort of a more collective way of pooling risk so that than you would find, say, in a nuclear family setting. When my mother died when I was a little kid growing up in a nuclear family setting, we were completely bereft. She was our world. I'm not saying mothers aren't important in other settings, excuse me. But in groups that culturally emphasize pooling risk, collective concern, caring for everybody, reciprocal obligations, not just being an individualist or your individual household or nuclear family can care about itself, but not anyone else. There are endless studies and more ethnographic observation, also people giving testimony from their personal experiences, that people have these larger, depend on and have reciprocal obligations within larger networks, multi-generational families. And so any one person is less dependent on a single person for economic provision or caretaking.
Right.
And so in that sense, people themselves have autonomously developed ways of trying to at least mitigate somewhat those losses. And one of I think the problems with public health and social policy more generally is we don't recognize this.
Right.
I think we need to care about recognition justice as much as we do about distributional justice or restorative justice. And that's very clear through weathering, because if we are only, we can feel sympathy for kids who have suffered traumas or losses or material hardships or homelessness or whatever. But if we're thinking it in terms of, well, what would it be like for a child in a nuclear family to deal with that, we're going to go in the wrong directions of how to really support them. And so one of the things I think that's important is to realize there are these autonomous ways cultures and populations have figured out to adapt or respond to, or just deal with that hand they've been dealt. And if we want to help them do it even better, we need to support them in the right ways and not the wrong ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Your point's well taken. I think that especially right now, in 2026, we're dealing with a lot of tumult and uncertainty in the public health world, especially regarding funding and priorities of what you can do and can't do in terms of work. But as you point out, many communities have dealt with less or not at all for many, many decades, if not centuries. And so people figure out and they adapt to how do we pull our resources? How do we adapt to the world around us? How do we set up sort of non-traditional ways of thinking about how we should be, or non-traditional ways of how we can adapt, whether it's family structure or something else.
I'm sorry, my phone is
No worries.
going off. I thought I had silence notifications, but apparently not. Um, so
That's okay.
I apologize. Could you repeat the last part?
Yeah, no. So it's I was just saying that people have to adapt, and so we're dealing with that as a field right now in public health. We're having to adapt to this historic moment with cuts to funding and certain things not being prioritized. But again, just pointing out that there's communities who have dealt with less or not no resources at all for decades and centuries. And so they've been able to adapt, whether it's social structures, so family structure, embracing extended family, even fictive kin. So kin who are not necessarily related, but people often say, well, that's my cousin or that's my aunt, and they're the neighbor or they're the godparents, et cetera. Those are structures that people sort of organically set up. So I think that's a point well taken in terms of what we can do from a public policy perspective. How can we foster the gems that exist and the adaptation that people have made, and that's just the reality. The other thing that sprang to mind as you're talking is the lived toll. I mean, you mentioned it with the loss of your mother, and I've experienced a great deal of loss as well from people who've passed away prematurely, and the effects of that from a mental health perspective, the uncertainty, like you mentioned, it turns your world upside down when you see someone who's passed away when they're not supposed to. And it definitely makes you more on edge. It makes you, the converses that you appreciate each day, but as you mentioned before, the trauma informed way of understanding what's happening with people, being able to appreciate that people are living like they're vigilant and they're feeling on edge because of the experiences that have not just happened to them, but also people within their networks.
Right. And that makes them even more exquisitely attuned to signs of danger because the world has been dangerous in their experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's also financial implications as well. One of my colleagues who's a sociologist down at Emory, Angela Dixon, talks about the toll financially of caring for people. So what happens when someone passes away prematurely, and how that really upends the just from a earnings potential and what you can rely on in terms of contributions from a financial perspective to a household or to a broader network are quite tremendous. So thanks for some of those thoughts about those psychosocial tolls related to weathering. I want to pivot a bit to some of your kind of what I would say is sort of bedrock, groundbreaking, all the ground analogies here. Around maternal and
Illogical. Yeah.
yeah. So around maternal and child health, one of your core findings, which I still struggle with today, is that slightly older Black mothers, and I don't mean like old maternal child age, I mean slightly older, they have greater risk of preterm birth, low birth weight. The mothers who are slightly older have higher likelihood of maternal mortality compared not just to teenage mothers, which again, that's another paradox that you were able to shed light on. People thought, oh, if you just decrease rates of teen pregnancy, then adverse birth outcomes will go away, and that's not true.
Big mistake.
Right. So you found that just women who are slightly older, not teenagers, but just slightly older, have worse outcomes for themselves and for their infants. And so, again, these findings directly contradict, which at the time is still, in many cases, is conventional wisdom. So I'm curious about how to make sense of all that. How do you characterize? I mean, it could be the easy answer, I suppose, could be weathering, but just like you to kind of riff on that a little bit about how your able to characterize what's happening with those slightly older Black moms compared to like not
Mhm.
just teenage moms, but also white women at the same age.
This is, excuse me. This I think is critical because just as you say, you've known about this from my teaching it to you and
Mhm.
other places, I'm sure, for a long time, but you still struggle with it.
Right.
And I'm sure people who are hearing this for the first time might even think I'm crazy. Certainly when I first talked about this, people did think I was crazy. and um, and it is still very much conventional wisdom
Yeah.
that the way to reduce, say, black white gaps in maternal mortality or low birth weight or preterm birth or growth retardation is to prevent teen childbirth. That's because they are relying on this developmental view of what age is, that there's a sense that there's a certain point where you're reproductively too immature for healthy childbearing and maybe psychosocially too immature for healthy childbearing. Then you reach some stage where you're mature and are in your prime reproductive years, and then you go into senescence and eventually, the shutdown entirely.
Right.
Um, uh, but that does happen. I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but the point is that weathering, especially in the populations that experience it most intensely, supersedes that in terms of how it affects reproduction. So that we have shown, starting with my own dissertation 40 years ago, that, but this has been reproduced endlessly, that in, say, the Black community, uh, people in their late teens, which is most teen mothers, we had a whole publicity stunt about teenage mothers being babies, having babies, and being 11 or 12. That's really
Mhm.
not who teenage mothers are for the most part. So that Black women in their late teens have better birth outcomes than even Black women in their 20s,
Right.
and much better than Black women in their late 20s, and remarkably better than Black women in their 30s. So we have actually, by pushing our cultural norms on on timing of childbearing without regard to weathering, we have actually shifted the culture in ways that have harmed Black women's and babies' health. And we've shown that this has actually happened. That in the era where we have worked dedicatedly to preventing teen childbearing or to um, uh, leading people to postpone childbearing into their 30s, that rate of maternal mortality, very low birth weight, preterm birth have gone up in the Black community.
Right.
And they've especially gone up among the working class. And now, in the most recent paper we've done, we're seeing that the white working class is also now experiencing this pattern. They they to extent always did, but in fact, to the extent we have, people will tell you, well, we've reduced the black white gap in say infant mortality. Well, we really haven't, or we have, but what made it happen is that for low income and less educated white women, they're having higher rates of poor birth outcomes, so they're getting closer to black women. And so it's really important that however troubled people are feeling at this idea that just seems so nuts, um, that we have to reorient what reproductive health is over your reproductive ages to take account of weathering, and that weathering is actually more important to health outcomes among the weathered populations than just regular reproductive development.
No, no, no. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that I can even think about anecdotally, like you read this stuff. I remember reading these papers that you have written and the book, and you think about, you know, you mentioned people thinking that, oh wow, Arline Geronimus must be out of her mind, but then it starts to happen. Like it happens in real life. I can think of all sorts of anecdotal examples of folks that you would know, even folks who are well trained within public health, who went on to have careers and make good money, and they did all the things, and they experienced adverse birth outcomes. They experience maternal mortality. I've known a number of folks who are in that range. They played by the rules. They did all the things that, like you said, conventional wisdom said. You should get a good education. You should delay childbearing. They get to their 30s when they've got their six-figure income and they've got their stable job, and they experience these really heartbreaking um, incidents. And so we've seen that in popular culture as well. People may be aware of Serena Williams, and what happened with her and her childbirth experience. I could think about a colleague of mine, Shalon Irving, who was at CDC, who was in the same postdoc program as me, who passed away shortly 10 days after childbirth. And again, she was an epidemiologic intelligence officer working at the CDC, did all the things, had 2 PhDs, et cetera, and goes on and on and on. And met her demise 10 days after childbirth. So I think it's important to note, again, not just that this work is paradoxical and important, but it's real. And I always tell folks, sometimes I hate being right.
Yes, I certainly do.
I'm sure that's been something that you've said to yourself throughout your career. Sometimes I've had findings that I'm like, that can't be right. I know I theorized this, but I really don't want this to be correct.
Well, in fact, part of why I wrote this book, I never planned to write a book. I think early on in my career, there were a variety of publishers who wanted me to write a book because they thought it would sell because it sounded so crazy, which is not the reason to write a book, just to be controversial. But I started working in maternal and child health issues. And then I kind of worked up the life course and had gotten away from them and was dealing more with young adults and middle-aged adults. And then as I aged, I got more interested in aging. And now that my kids are of reproductive age, I'm thinking again about kids and babies. But so I had been away from maternal and child health for a while when we started seeing these stories about Shalon Irving and Serena Williams, and many others who were not famous, but had done, either at a middle class level or a very highly educated level, had played by the rules and worked hard and were economically secure to some extent, if not wealthy. And so I was really stopped in my tracks when I looked at that statistically and saw that things had gotten worse. These graphs I had first kind of introduced in my dissertation of how birth outcomes among Black women kind of go up steeply from the teens through the rest of the reproductive ages, they had gotten worse. They were steeper. If you talk about women who have at least a college education and who postpone childbearing, say to their mid to late 30s, which is what our dominant culture wants us to do, what you see is they have 6 times the rate of maternal mortality and of other poor birth outcomes than similarly situated white women. And so it's sort of a testament to a few things that I really hope people get beyond just thinking I'm nuts and think about. It testifies to how much we don't support people in maternal and child health. It testifies to how we have such simplistic and shallow and privilege-informed ideas about what the risk factors are, and what the right policy would be to solve them. We've done those policies for 30, 40 years, and things have gotten worse. Women have themselves done all the right things of working hard and playing by the rules, and things are worse for them than they would have been, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when they were younger. And I think part of how we can reorient ourselves to that is rather than thinking about these things as paradoxical sort of implies that it's kind of natural law, what are actually really just the facts and values of privileged people's lives. And that what we should do, instead of thinking about them as paradoxical, or when they strike as paradoxical, and this is how I've sort of done my own research, is think about, well, what could really be happening that makes this predictable rather than paradoxical, that makes this make sense rather than be nuts. And so I think one can very directly think about these weathering processes, both the actual exposures to them, the high effort coping with them, the psychological losses, the various sensitivities they inspire, and realize that, just as you're more likely to be hypertensive in your 30s if you come from certain traditionally marginalized groups, you're more likely to have a poor birth outcome. Some of that is even directly related. Hypertension is a huge risk factor for a poor birth outcome. And so if we reorient ourselves to more what I call looking through a weathering lens rather than this more what I call developmentalism or privilege informed sense of the cadence of life course demands and norms for white American upper and middle class Americans, then it's not paradoxical anymore. And we can then think about, well, what do we have to intervene in or change? Instead of saying, stop having your children when you're, at the age where from your lived experience and your elders know from their lived experience is probably the healthiest time for you to have a baby.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you started to mention some solutions and kind of reframing paradox and thinking about, through a weathering lens, why would this make sense? So one thing, in addition to what conventional wisdom tells us, working hard, play by the rules, so a very individual effort, bootstrap mentality. So pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But Martin Luther King famously said, it seems like a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps. And so I think that it's important and that's the pivot for me right now in our conversation is, what do we do about this? You've mentioned, for example, it's not just age, but it's also socioeconomic status that doesn't have the same protective effects that you would expect. Or maybe, again, from a weathering lens, maybe we can characterize what's going on there a little bit better. So even in my own work, one of those answers to me was always, well, you've got to give people more access to income and education, and that'll make everything go away. And I can say for sure that is definitely not the case. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit about that, some of those findings, again, through a weathering lens as it relates to social mobility. Education is still in 2026 the key vehicle of upward social mobility. A lot of people still think that if you just get to a comfortable living wage, then that makes all these health outcomes go away. But you and I both know from our own empirical work that is not necessarily true. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit about why we won't see those things, or why we don't see those payoffs, especially as it relates to, say, John Henryism or the stress vigilance that you mentioned before. How would you characterize what's happening with regard to social mobility?
Well, first of all, I just want to say it doesn't have to be like this. So it's not that people shouldn't get more education or strive for higher social or income. And it's not that.
Yeah, we definitely want you to come in and study here with us. Yeah.
And we definitely, don't want to say there's nothing money can buy that can, be health promoting. So let me just be clear about that. But what's also true is what you need to think about is how do you make circumstances of schools and jobs, and institutions writ large, places where everybody can thrive and where there aren't groups of people who are having to trade off getting more income and education for their health, who aren't paying what Chairman James calls this sort of tax paid by marginalized people. And I want to point out an interesting study that actually one of, I think, your cohort mates, or you at least overlapped with, a former doctoral student here, Cindy Colin, who's now the chair of the sociology department at Ohio State University. She did a study where she looked at only at Black Americans who had college educations. And she used longitudinal data, and she compared those who went to HBCUs to those who went to predominantly white colleges. And what she showed was that I think it's by the age of 30, those who went to predominantly white institutions were much more likely to have metabolic syndrome than those who went to HBCUs. In other words, they had a lot of the prerequisites to ending up with hypertension, diabetes, and a variety of other, I would say they weathered more. And so it's not the education per se, it's the circumstances of that education, what kinds of supports you have, and also the fact that if you're in more integrated settings that were designed, like predominantly white institutions were mostly designed, to exclude African-American students, and women also to some extent, and some other Asian and Jewish students during the early 20th century. So what supports do you have for that experience, not to have you be vigilant all the time, on alert for all those signs that you may be in danger, even if the danger is social identity, safety? There's a large literature in social psychology that shows that when marginalized people enter a new situation, I would call it a new situation, say if you're a first-gen student going to a predominantly white university, that they immediately become, and again, this is all spontaneous, they become really sensitive for cues in the environment that suggest whether they think they can feel they'll be treated fairly in that environment, whether they're can be authentic, or whether they have to instead do code switching and respectability politics, whether they can speak up or not. And so the actual experience at institutions where, and this would be true for workplace institutions as well, and for neighborhoods. So your money buys you, into a white neighborhood, upper class white neighborhood, but it doesn't change how you're perceived sometimes, or the cues you are sensitive to when you're around your white neighbors, that can set off these stress responses. So I guess all I'm saying is we need to think not just number of years of education or amount of income, but we need to think about what is the experience like for different kind of people in those situations, how much they need to be on their guard and thus activating stress reactions more chronically or more often. And we have to think in terms of intervention, what do we have to do to make these places, whether they're schools or neighborhoods, places where everybody can thrive and people can relax and release, and they don't have to be always on guard. We just need to take that different orientation, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think about that in my own work, as you know, in terms of cost of upward social mobility. Mm-hmm. And so what those costs could be, entering spaces that might be new to you, could be very different from your social class background, very different from your racial point of origin. And so that's taxing for many people as they come into those spaces and they learn that they're different, They learn that people have different social class experiences, and it's eye opening for many, and it's troubling and stressful for many. So as people think about something like, as you mentioned, Sherman James, his concept of John Henryism. So going back to that old folklore of the steel driving man. So you work hard through stress, and you work hard through adversity, and you get to a magical moment, and then in John Henry's case, you drop dead from exertion. And so that's one of those things that we have to think about with regard to what we ask people to do at the individual level. And I think it puts the onus more away from the personal responsibility aspect, but thinking what's upstream, what's social, and what's structural that we can be providing to people. And we only have a few minutes left, but I want to put a plug in for your book. A lot of the conversation that we're having today stems into the book, and as well as the rich scholarship that you've done over the years. And so some of these concepts that we're talking about are just touching the treetops right now. And so I will recommend for viewers to take a look at the book to get a fuller treatment of what's happening here. The other thing I wanted to kind of round out, and I'll keep my eye on the chat to see if there's questions that come in from the audience. But as we think about what do you do with all of this, what are solutions? I know you've had some pointed criticism of social policies, for example, which are certainly appropriate. But I'm kind of curious about, what are some fundamental shifts that you think are necessary to make it possible for people to thrive, essentially, and to meet people where they're at, and to make it so that we're not superimposing external values or the right values from the right people, but we can meet people where they're at and ensure that they're able to thrive. So what are some things that we can be thinking about there?
Yeah, it's obviously hard to talk about this now where all the resources that might go to that are being taken away. But I think from a number of dimensions, one could still do things. For instance, a very simple and very inexpensive thing that social psychologists have found is, and this is not in terms of race, but it's in terms of women in STEM classrooms, is that if they simply change the posters on the wall, women will do as well, or girls and women will do as well as boys and men in those classrooms. But what are the change the posters on the wall mean? Instead of having Star Trek, this has been done through randomized controlled trials. Instead of having Star Trek posters on the wall of a science classroom, you have nature posters. And this is, I think, a really interesting example of how much we are unconsciously looking for cues of whether we belong somewhere. Because apparently Star Trek posters somehow signal to women that they don't belong in ways that nature posters don't. And so with just that change of, so there are some solutions that are so simple and can build on each other. So then if you had your nature posters and you excelled in your STEM classroom, then you're going to feel more confident about yourself. You're going to perform better. You're going to persist in STEM if you're interested in it, and you're going to continue to do well and maybe have a career in it. So some things are so simple, and they're just about changing settings. Part of the problem is we've thought so much about changing individuals, but because of the importance of cues to that whole mechanistic cue to stress reaction process, changing settings in a variety of ways can make huge difference. And we've seen that happen again in randomized controlled trials where very simple cues, you randomly assign people, Black college students, to take the very same test, but call it an intelligence test, and white students also, and you assign others to something where you're just saying it's not, you don't use that word, intelligence test. And they take the very same test, and those who all the prompt they had was, this is an intelligence test, that cued them through their fluency in racialized stereotypes to immediately be on their guard because they don't want to prove the stereotype that that Black students are less intelligent than white students. That in turn turns on physiological stress reactions, which are actually then impair their ability to do well on the test. So it can almost become self-fulfilling, and then it gets naturalized by people who care to keep thinking there are racial differences in intelligence. And so we can look for these various ways to change the cues and settings. Some of those will be much harder than just changing a poster, but we can be aware as professors, for example, what are the cues we're giving? Are we saying at the beginning of a class, look to the right, look to the left, one of those people will not be here by midterms or whatever. And so we're kind of saying your capacity to do well is fixed. Instead of saying everybody can pass this course, everyone can even do well on this course. You might all, not get A pluses, but come to me if you need help or support. So that you have, I guess what social psychologists calls that is a growth mindset. Your capacities aren't fixed. They can grow with support and effort and access to the information you need to learn. And so there's a lot of things we can do in small settings. It's harder. I think we can kind of do this at small settings, local settings. I think at the national level, especially right now, it's pretty hard, if not impossible. But there'll hopefully be a future that's different, and we can think about how to upscale to more national things.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. Really appreciate you for making time today and all your efforts and contributions to the field. I guess if I had to leave us with one set of recommendations, one I like to ask, I want to steal this directly from Ezra Klein's podcast, which is, can you tell us something that's really important for especially for folks who are new to this work? What's something that they should read? So they should definitely read Weathering. But in addition to that, anything that you would recommend that people start to delve into if they want to address some of these challenges that you've described?
Well, I think reading books like Sapolsky has written books for people who are not neuroendocrinologists, like Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. I also think reading books such as books about Black joy or the role of finding places to be authentic, to relax, to get a break from the psychological, physiological stress reactions. There's a lot of books that have come out, dating back to Audre Lorde, who talked about the importance of radical self-care. But more recently, there are a lot of people writing books based't their experiences about that. And I think they're very informative. I think that just recognizing that we think what we think are truths or given as givens, because it's not just that it's our lived experience, which is a term a lot of people use, but we've erased other experiences. Right. And we've also think our ways of adapting to the world are moral and are the right ways, as opposed to that they work for us given our the resources we have, the worldviews we have, the connections we have. And so I think there's just many different places to look. And in a way, what Weathering is pulling in from this interdisciplinary literature, from historical work, from even just memoirs, and starting to see, wow, the dots can be connected in totally different ways than we thought was literally the truth.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that response. I think that's a great reminder to our viewers to think about the juxtaposition. We've talked a little bit about weathering, we've talked about stress, but also thinking about well-being and how to thrive. And some of those great authors that you mentioned, like Audre Lorde or All About Love, Bell Hooks, those are things that I think that I try to lean into right now in a time that doesn't feel all that great. But knowing that, again, love is the way, positivity is the way, making sure that we protect ourself and our mental health and our well-being is really crucial. So I think that's a great place to leave us.
And interestingly, I've heard some women talk to me, Black women, about wondering whether going into, becoming entrepreneurs rather than working in institutions might be one way to thrive, or whether even moving to foreign countries without the same dominant culture might be another way. I don't know, and obviously not everybody has those choices, but people are thinking of new things to try and capture joy and validation and not have to deal with all the code switching and malarkey. I grew up in Boston, so I apologize for malarkey. I know that's a bad word, but anyway, that you might have to deal with in other settings.
Well, that's a great place to leave us. Thank you so much again for the time today, as well as all the contributions that you've made in scholarship and pouring into students like me. And we thank our viewers for checking in with us today. Hopefully, you've taken away some key concepts, and we'll take a look at the book in your leisure time. Again, thanks for everyone for joining, and we really appreciate you all for being with us today.
Thank you.